Ever wonder what happens when the one who always texts first suddenly goes quiet? When the person who overthinks every message finally stops sending any? When the anxious stops chasing? The avoidant is forced to face what they've been running from all along. Let's talk about the shift in power, clarity, and chaos that unfolds when emotional dynamics flip. When someone with an anxious attachment style finally stops chasing, it's not just silence that fills the space, it's clarity. And that clarity is uncomfortable, especially for the avoidant who has spent so long relying on the dynamic of pursuit and retreat. You see, the anxious partner has been conditioned to believe that love must be earned. They're often the ones initiating conversations, asking for reassurance, planning the next steps, trying to fix things before they're even broken. Their emotional world is built around the idea that they must do more to be loved. So they chase, not because they're weak, but because they care deeply and fear abandonment. They interpret emotional distance as danger and closeness as safety, which is why they reach out again and again, even when it's not reciprocated. But something changes over time. The anxious person begins to see that their needs are not being met. They begin to recognize the one-sidedness of the connection. They begin to notice that no matter how much they try, they can't control someone else's emotional availability. Slowly, they realize that the anxiety isn't coming from within them. It's coming from constantly trying to connect with someone who keeps shutting the door. And that realization is powerful. Because when the anxious person understands that their chasing isn't creating closeness but enabling distance, they stop. Not out of resentment, not to play games, but because they finally understand that peace isn't found in pursuit. It's found in self-respect. And that's when everything flips. The avoidant, who has become so used to being the one with the emotional upper hand, suddenly finds themselves without the familiar pattern. The texts that used to come in like clockwork, silent, the emotional check-ins they took for granted, gone, the safety net of always being wanted, ripped away. At first, the avoidant might feel relieved. They might even think, finally, space. But that relief is short-lived, because that space they always wanted suddenly becomes a vacuum, one where they're no longer being pulled toward anything, one where the anxious partner is no longer defining the rhythm of the relationship. The avoidant has built their comfort zone around emotional distance. They fear vulnerability. They often feel smothered when someone gets too close, so they pull away to regain control. But here's the truth. That control only works when someone else is still trying. When the anxious partner stops trying, the avoidant has no distraction, no buffer, no one to absorb the emotional responsibility. They are left to sit with the very intimacy they've been avoiding. Only now it's not being offered, it's being withheld, and that's where discomfort sets in. The dynamic has shifted. The anxious partner is no longer driven by the need to be chosen. They're driven by the desire for peace, for stability, for connection that feels mutual, not performative. They stop accepting breadcrumbs and start demanding meals. Not through words, but through action. They remove their energy, their emotional labor, their investment, and that absence, it speaks louder than any argument ever could. Now, the avoidant is left with their thoughts, with the reality that the person who once made everything easy, the emotional glue, the one who softened every harsh edge of distance, is no longer available to do so. For the first time, the avoidant has to question their own patterns, not because someone is pushing them to, but because the space they created is no longer comfortable. It's isolating. The dynamic of chase and retreat is broken, and in that brokenness, the avoidant is exposed. They begin to notice the things they used to dismiss, the warmth they ignored, the care they underestimated, the presence they took for granted. The absence of the anxious partner isn't just felt emotionally. It's felt physically, in the empty messages, the stillness, the lack of emotional friction that once allowed them to maintain distance without true disconnection. This new silence forces introspection. It's not that the avoidant didn't care, it's that they didn't realize how much the other person was holding everything together. Now they have to face that truth, that perhaps the distance they craved wasn't safety, It was avoidance. It was fear masked as independence. And without the anxious person chasing, they're forced to sit with the very intimacy they thought they were protecting themselves from. Not because someone is knocking on the door, asking to be let in, but because the door is now closed and no one's coming back to open it for them. The avoidant personality often moves through relationships craving space, autonomy, and emotional distance. They tell themselves that closeness feels overwhelming, that intimacy is suffocating, that they need room to breathe. They build walls disguised as boundaries, escape routes masked as independence, and coping mechanisms dressed up as emotional maturity. And for a while, that distance gives them the illusion of control. As long as someone is still reaching out, still texting first, still pushing to close the gap, they feel safe. They don't have to confront their fear of intimacy or vulnerability because the anxious partner is doing all the emotional heavy lifting. The avoidant gets to stay detached while still being emotionally fed. But what happens when that pattern is interrupted? What happens when the anxious partner, after feeling exhausted, unheard, and emotionally depleted, finally decides to stop reaching out? At first, the avoidant may welcome it. They feel relieved not to have to respond to emotional check-ins, to constant messages, to invitations that seem too close, too soon. They tell themselves that space is what they needed all along. They mistake the silence for peace, for simplicity, for freedom. But slowly, and often without fully realizing it, that space begins to take on a different shape. It's no longer just silence, it's absence. It's not just a pause in communication, it's disconnection. It's not the kind of quiet that brings calm. It's the kind that makes the avoidant start to question what just shifted. This is the nightmare they didn't see coming. The anxious partner was never just needy or clingy. They were the engine that kept the relationship emotionally alive. They were the one initiating connection, holding space, softening the emotional distance. And now, with that energy gone, the avoidant starts to feel a strange discomfort, one that they can't immediately identify because they've trained themselves to see closeness as the threat. But now, it's not closeness that feels scary. It's the void. It's the realization that the person who always cared enough to try has finally stopped. Not because they don't care anymore, but because they've reached their limit, because their self-worth has outgrown the cycle of pursuit and withdrawal. The avoidant begins to replay moments in their mind, times when they ignored messages not because they were busy, but because they didn't want to deal with the emotional weight. Times when they said they needed space, but were really running from the fear of being truly seen. Times when they felt annoyed by affection, not because it was too much, but because it made them feel exposed. And now, with no one reaching out, there's no distraction, no emotional safety net, no buffer between them and their own suppressed feelings. The space becomes heavy. It forces them to confront what they've avoided all along. That connection isn't something to be rationed, and love isn't something that thrives in distance. The anxious partner's absence doesn't just highlight what's missing. It illuminates everything that was being avoided. The emotional mirror becomes clearer. The silence starts to echo. The avoidant may find themselves checking their phone, wondering why there's no message waiting. They may scroll through old conversations, rereading messages they once brushed off. They may feel a pang of something they rarely allow themselves to feel: regret. They wonder if they pushed too far, if they waited too long, if the emotional door that was always left slightly open has finally closed. They feel the loss, but it's not just the loss of a person. It's the loss of a pattern they depended on. The dynamic where they held the power through detachment no longer exists. The anxious person has stopped trying to prove their worth, stopped seeking validation, stopped filling in the emotional gaps. And now those gaps feel like chasms. In this new silence, the avoidant isn't just alone, they're exposed. They are face to face with their own emotional limitations, no longer able to hide behind someone else's efforts. They realize that what they once called peace was really avoidance, and what they called space was often self-protection at the cost of connection. The anxious partner's decision to stop chasing doesn't just remove pressure, it removes the shield that allowed the avoidant to bypass growth. Now, they must reckon with what it means to be in a relationship that isn't built on imbalance, but on mutual effort. And for the first time, they're not being pulled back in. They're being left to figure it out on their own. The shift that happens when the anxious partner stops chasing isn't just about silence, it's about accountability. In the dynamic between the anxious and the avoidant, the anxious partner often takes on the role of the emotional manager. They ask the questions, initiate the difficult conversations, bridge the gaps after arguments, and constantly monitor the temperature of the relationship to make sure it's still functioning. The avoidant becomes used to this rhythm. They rely on the anxious partner to handle the emotional labor, to carry the weight of connection, and to do the work of intimacy on their behalf. It creates an emotional imbalance where one person is always reaching and the other is always pulling away. This pattern protects the avoidant from ever having to fully step into the vulnerability that real intimacy requires. But when the anxious person reaches a breaking point and chooses peace over pursuit, that imbalance collapses. Suddenly, there's no one left to reach out first, no one checking in, no one initiating the repair, and this absence doesn't just leave a silence, it places all the emotional responsibility directly in the hands of the avoidant. The dynamic has flipped. Now, if there is to be connection, if there is to be effort, it must come from the very person who spent so long retreating. That shift is jarring because for the first time, the avoidant can't depend on someone else to close the distance. They are forced to ask themselves whether they're willing to do the work they've always avoided. This is where things get uncomfortable. The avoidant often believes they're emotionally self-sufficient, that they're better off maintaining independence than risking vulnerability. They may have convinced themselves that their need for distance is a strength, but now, with no anxious partner to cushion the impact of emotional neglect, that distance feels different. It feels cold, it feels lonely, and it no longer makes them feel powerful. Instead, it makes them feel disconnected from something they never fully appreciated while they had it. They start to realize that emotional independence isn't the same as emotional avoidance. Independence is being able to stand on your own and still choose connection. Avoidance is running from the very thing you secretly crave. This confrontation with themselves is not easy. The avoidant begins to question why they never called back, why they took so long to reply, why they minimized every emotional request. They may try to tell themselves it wasn't that serious, that it wouldn't have lasted anyway, but underneath the justifications is a quiet discomfort they can't ignore. That they let someone else carry the emotional weight because they were too afraid to do it themselves. And now that the anxious partner has stopped, the avoidant is staring at a relationship that won't sustain itself without their input. There's no emotional script to follow anymore, no partner giving them cues. They are left to generate emotional energy on their own, and they're not used to it. This is the turning point. Because up until now, the avoidant has lived in a pattern where someone else's pursuit allowed them to remain emotionally disengaged without ever fully losing the relationship. The anxious partner always came back. They always made the effort. And because of that, the avoidant never truly had to face the consequences of their detachment. But now, that safety net is gone. The dynamic that protected them from growth has disintegrated, and in its place is a stark choice: step up or stay stuck. Stepping up means reaching out, initiating connection, acknowledging emotional needs, both theirs and the other person's. It means asking themselves what they're afraid of, and whether that fear is worth more than the relationship they could have if they were brave enough to show up fully. It's not about becoming suddenly emotionally fluent. It's about trying, about moving toward rather than away. But for someone who has spent so long equating distance with safety, this choice isn't just challenging, it's terrifying. Because now the avoidant has to confront what they've been avoiding. Not just intimacy, but the fear of not being enough when they show their true self. When they're no longer protected by silence or retreat, they have to wrestle with whether they can be fully seen and still be accepted. And that kind of vulnerability is the very thing they've spent a lifetime avoiding. But with no anxious partner left to chase, distract, or absorb the tension, they are left to face it on their own. And in that space, emotional responsibility is no longer optional, it's required. When the anxious partner stops chasing, something fundamental begins to shift, not just in the dynamic between them and the avoidant, but within themselves. This isn't a sudden snap or an impulsive reaction. It's the slow, painful, empowering buildup of self-awareness over time. The anxious individual, after countless cycles of pursuing, questioning, over-explaining, and accommodating, reaches a point where their nervous system can't take it anymore. They're no longer fueled by hope that their effort will lead to closeness. They've finally understood that connection isn't supposed to be this one-sided, that love shouldn't be earned through anxiety, but welcomed through mutual effort. And that realization isn't bitter, it's liberating. It births boundaries that were once impossible to set. These boundaries aren't loud or dramatic. They don't always come with a grand speech or an ultimatum. Often they arrive in silence, in the text that doesn't get sent, in the call that doesn't get returned. In the moment where the anxious partner would have normally reached out, apologized, explained themselves, or asked how the other person felt, and instead they sit still. Not because they don't care anymore, but because they've learned to care about themselves too. That stillness is where their boundary lives. It's the decision to no longer abandon themselves for the sake of preserving a relationship that cannot meet them halfway. The avoidant, who has long been accustomed to the anxious partner bending, stretching, and breaking in order to maintain connection, now finds themselves face to face with something unfamiliar: resistance. Not aggressive, not confrontational, but firm. The anxious partner no longer rushes in to fix things. They don't explain away their emotions or beg for clarity. They've started to draw a line, not to hurt the avoidant, but to protect their own sense of peace. And for the avoidant, who has built their comfort around emotional distance, this new boundary is unsettling, because the dynamic they were used to is gone. What used to feel like emotional pressure from the anxious partner now feels like absence. What used to annoy them, the endless clarifying questions, the emotional depth, the craving for connection, now reveals itself as the glue that held the whole thing together. And now that glue is gone, what's left is a relationship stripped of its codependency, a connection that now only survives on mutual effort, not the anxious partner's unrelenting drive to keep it alive. The avoidant has to face a reality they've never been fully prepared for, a version of the anxious partner that is no longer afraid of losing them, a version that understands their worth, that knows closeness shouldn't be something they have to chase. The anxious person begins to make decisions not from fear, but from clarity. They aren't withdrawing as a strategy, they're detaching as an act of self-care. Their boundaries are not punishments, they're expressions of growth. And in doing this, they begin to change how the avoidant has to engage. The avoidant is now left in a space where they must decide, do they lean in or let go? Because the anxious person is no longer holding the emotional weight for both of them. The boundary forces the avoidant to confront the part of themselves that always expected more than they gave. It forces them to question whether their comfort with emotional distance was ever real, or if it was just a way to avoid the fear of vulnerability. And now they have to face that fear without someone constantly trying to soothe it for them. This new version of the anxious partner doesn't chase, doesn't over-apologize, and doesn't try to win love through performance. They communicate differently. They pause before responding. They no longer feel the need to explain their existence or justify their feelings. That shift is deeply unsettling to the avoidant, who was used to the dynamic being in their favor. But now, the anxious person has come home to themselves. They've realized that needing connection is not a weakness, but abandoning yourself to get it is. And that knowledge creates an emotional boundary stronger than any wall the avoidant could ever build. For the first time, the avoidant has to engage in a relationship that demands mutuality. The anxious person no longer provides the emotional scaffolding. The avoidant can't lean on the familiar roles anymore. They have to show up differently or risk losing the connection entirely. The anxious partner's boundaries don't just change the relationship, they reveal what the relationship was built on. And when that foundation no longer includes self-sacrifice, the entire structure is tested. The anxious person has chosen to no longer trade their peace for proximity. And the avoidant must now decide whether they can meet someone in the middle, not because they're being chased, but because they're finally being invited to rise. When the anxious partner finally stops chasing, they don't just reclaim their energy, they reclaim their identity. For so long, they've been shaping themselves around the avoidant's comfort. They've dimmed their needs, diluted their emotions, and twisted themselves into emotional contortionists just to keep the connection alive. They've mistaken crumbs for consistency, mixed up tension with passion, and equated silence with mystery. But what they were really doing was abandoning their true selves in the hope that one day the avoidant would finally come around, would finally see them, would finally choose them without having to be convinced. And when that doesn't happen, when that moment never fully comes, something in them breaks, but not in the way you'd think. It's not the shattering kind of break that leaves them weaker. It's the kind that splits the illusion from reality, the kind that separates love from longing and attachment from actual intimacy. What begins to unfold is a journey back to self-worth. The anxious partner starts to realize that their emotions are not too much. They were just being given to someone who never knew what to do with them. That their desire for closeness wasn't a flaw, it just wasn't matched. And slowly they start pulling all the misplaced energy back in. The overthinking that used to be about, what did I do wrong, becomes, what do I actually want? The obsession with fixing becomes curiosity about healing. And where once there was a need for external reassurance, there's now a growing trust in their own instincts. They stop over-explaining. They stop over-apologizing. They stop performing for love and start practicing it with themselves first. This self-return doesn't just empower them, it changes the way they engage with the avoidant completely. Because the anxious person isn't operating from fear anymore. They're no longer trying to preserve something that isn't preserving them. They've given enough second chances to silence. They've analyzed every unread message, justified every emotional retreat, and waited long enough for potential to become reality. And when they finally let go of the fantasy, they make room for truth. That truth might sting at first, but it frees them. It opens up space for something real, something reciprocal. Meanwhile, the avoidant is beginning to feel a very different shift. What used to feel like space and freedom now feels like distance and uncertainty. They may not fully understand what's changed, but they feel it. The energy is no longer coming toward them. The reassurance is no longer being offered. The anxious partner's eyes are no longer fixed on them. And what was once a position of control starts to feel like isolation. They're no longer being emotionally pursued, which means they're no longer being emotionally regulated by someone else. And for the first time, they have to look inward. They have to consider what they've contributed. They have to ask themselves why they feel unsettled now that the very thing they said they wanted, space, is finally here. This is where the avoidant begins to feel the cost of emotional distance. Not just the loss of attention, but the loss of emotional intimacy they never fully embraced when it was being offered. They remember the late-night calls they ignored, the thoughtful messages they left unanswered, the emotional moments they deflected with jokes or silence. They start to feel the absence in the way routines feel emptier, how the quiet now holds questions instead of peace. And the longer they sit in that silence, the more they begin to understand what they pushed away. Not just a partner, but a mirror. A mirror that reflected everything they didn't want to face. Fear of being known, of being needed, of being vulnerable. But now that mirror is gone. And in its place is the realization that intimacy was never the problem. It was the story they told themselves about it. The anxious partner isn't there to rewrite that story anymore. They're busy writing their own. They're no longer waiting for someone to meet them halfway. They're not holding space for maybes. They're not interested in building castles on quicksand. They're moving forward not because they stopped caring, but because they started caring enough to leave patterns that cost them their peace. For the avoidant, that shift is jarring. It challenges everything they believed about connection, that they could keep one foot in and one foot out, that they could be chosen without choosing back, that someone would always stay no matter how distant they became. But now they're witnessing something new. The anxious partner isn't angry, they're unavailable. Not in a petty way, but in a purposeful way. They're choosing themselves with the same passion they once poured into someone else. And that choice reverberates. It forces the avoidant to confront not just what they lost, but why they lost it. Not just what happened, but what they never stepped up to create. The anxious person didn't just walk away, they woke up. And now everything is different.